Hola, clase. We are discussing Chapter 2, Class, in Racial Formations in the United States. Racial Formation in the United States. And this whole chapter, it starts on page 53, and it goes through 73 there's a lot of footnotes. But this whole chapter is really about class-based theories of race. And they give you a definition right in that very first paragraph on page 53 that reads, it's a quote from a scholar named Stuart Hall: "Social divisions which assume a distinctively racial or ethnic character can be attributed or explained principally by reference to economic structures and processes. The class paradigm of race includes schools of thought running from right to left, but they all afford primacy to economic relationships, which include market exchange, distribution, and production." And we'll get started talking about what all of that means. And I mean, they do a pretty good job here in the introduction. So if you look at the very bottom of that page on page 53, they ask the question in the third full body paragraph: how then do we define the class paradigm of race, and how can the variety of approaches which emphasize economic structures and processes and their analysis of racial phenomena be categorized, linked, and compared? So when we're thinking of class and we're thinking about production and these terms that are being used, so you have market exchange, distribution, production. Market exchange is the value in terms of what products are being sold or what is being traded in any given society as something that's valuable, that's economically based. So you might consider like the market exchange for something like an iPhone. Distribution is how it gets into different people's hands. And then, of course, the production is how these products are made. And so this chapter is going to talk about how race affects all of those aspects of our economy and on class, and that understanding race through class is limiting, and it doesn't take in a lot of other considerations that need to be thought about when you're determining race and racism and why these processes exist. So the authors state at the bottom of page 53 that there are 3 different approaches that they're going to talk about: the market, stratification, and a class conflict approach. So you don't need to know those terms in depth yet, but they do on the very next page, on page 54, give you a quick definition for each of those terms. So if you look at the top of 54, and it's a carryover paragraph, it says, in exchange relationships, that's the market. So when one country maybe is trading with another country, some types of goods are being exchanged, that's a free market. And systems of distribution, that is what stratification is how these items or products are distributed. And then finally, in conflict over the production processes. That is, for instance, if you're thinking of how a company might be organized, you have very, very few people at the top that make the most money in a company. That could be like the CEO of the company, the person who, if you're thinking of Tesla, you could think of Elon Musk. He's the one. He owns the company. He makes the most money. However, the trickle-down effect and what Marxism is all about when we get talking about that in this chapter is that The people that are creating that massive amount of wealth for him are the laborers, all the people in the factories at the bottom who are working on putting the cars together and are not earning as much as that one head of the company is. And so those are the primary points we're going to look at, and we start with the market relations approach, which begins at the bottom of page 54. And I think really, if you're trying to understand kind of this social exchange between groups or entities that are sharing and giving goods across like boundaries and borders and whatnot, really what you want to understand is that it becomes a effect of kind of maintaining power. That's talked a little bit about on page 55. So they talk about post-war civil rights struggle, and that there was some market disequilibrium. So when they're talking about post-Civil War, remember, after the Civil War in the United States, a big source of production, of labor production, all the black slaves were set free. And so you lost a lot of those workers at the bottom, if you're kind of thinking of like a pyramid, and the one at top is making all the money. Well, that whole bottom of the pyramid kind of ceased to exist, at least legally. And then, so there's kind of a disequilibrium where the economy can really collapse, because if you were relying on free or cheap or enslaved labor, and that labor is no longer forced to do that work, then how are you going to have these markets of cotton making it up north, or cotton being transported over to England for their uses in this time period, right? And so, yes. So they kind of give you some ideas in that page 55, in that second full paragraph, of the kind of instability that occurred really quickly after slavery ended. And actually, what's put in place before Jim Crow laws is this very sweet period called Reconstruction, in which, instead of the whole kind of market system falling apart, the black population was able to actually hold positions of power, like in politics and in office, and it was actually a time of flourishing for a very brief period. And I'll talk more about that, and I have a video that I'll show as well online. But if you don't understand what Reconstruction means, or you've never really heard that term, you might want to read the pages at the bottom of 56 through 57 more closely, because they're going to talk about the Civil War, they're going to talk about before the Civil War, they're going to talk about after the Civil War, and of course about the creation of unions. And so they're giving you, the authors are giving you a breadth of the history in that short context from 56 to 57 that you might find really valuable. And I think it's really important to also note that in this market exchange theory of race, individual needs are prioritized. So rather than group well-being or community well-being, that one individual who holds all that power and all that money, their needs and rights are considered epitome, the top. We have to, this is a free market. You either sink or swim. And so if someone raises quickly to the top and becomes a billionaire, it is their hard work and efforts, and we have to protect that as a country of the free. So regardless of who is harmed in the process. Okay, so that's just a little bit about that market relations approach. That's what that whole, starting on page 54 through 58 is talking about. Now, when you get to page 58, we get into that stratification theory that I discussed with you earlier at the beginning of this chapter, and it's just the distribution of resources. So who gets what, and how much do they get, and what kind of quality do they get, and there's a really good question about that if you look at the middle of 58 in that second full body paragraph. It says, especially since the civil rights movement challenged the racial inequality that had been taken for granted, especially by whites throughout U.S. history, there has been an unending debate on the dynamics of racial stratification. What accounts for its persistence and depth? In what ways does it parallel, and what ways does it diverge from a class stratification? So if you're thinking of class stratification as being the distribution of resources in which those higher up in a class system receive more and those lower on a class system receive less, a racial distribution or stratification can be considered the same thing. If you're able to belong to a dominant racial group that holds power or maintains privilege in a society, you get more. Whereas if you're in a community that typically does not hold the power, you're going to be getting less based on your race. Okay? So that's what's really talked about in that whole paragraph. And they give you a really good example at the very end, last sentence of that big paragraph I was reading. Median black wealth now stands at about 5% of white wealth. And it's an appalling statistic. And then there's disparities between whites and Latinas, Latinos, whites and Native Americans, whites and some not all Asian American groups. So this wealth income inequality comes up in the stratification theory. So for instance, if you are Japanese or Japanese American, your amount of wealth was heavily impacted, generational wealth, by the internment camps that occurred during World War II, in which Japanese Americans lost their businesses, lost their homes, were basically locked up in prisons during that time. And then when they were released, it wasn't like, oh, here's your business again, we're going to give it back, here's your home again. Many of them lost that, and it was never given back. That's not usually how it goes. When someone takes something that's yours, it can be very difficult to get them to give it back. And then that affects the family's generations of wealth and where they have to build from. Okay. So on page 59, they talk a little bit about integration and about tokenism. And that's this, they don't necessarily say the word tokenism, but I highlighted it because at the bottom of 59, they said, while a significant number of blacks obtained what was essentially middle-class jobs, many in the public sector, the massive black underclass, was relegated to permanent marginality. So that sentence is the very last sentence of 59 before it moves on to 60, is saying, well, yeah, a few black community members made it. They made it to middle class. They broke through this class barrier. But if only 1% makes it through and 99% is still in poverty, how is that fair or equitable, right? So that's kind of that tokenism ideology where one individual within a community makes it, and then they're upheld as, hey, look, if this one person can make it, everyone from your community should be successful and be doing as well. And in actuality, that's not how society and life works. There can be a lot of people that work hard their entire life and never advance, never make it out of a certain class status. So the chapter continues. Free trade is talked about. When you see that term neoliberalism, it means free trade or deregulation of global economic trends. It's less government involvement in anything to do with business. It's like government has no say in what private businesses do or how they make their money. That's a very neoliberal approach to production. As you continue, I noted a couple of important sections that I would read more slowly. That includes on page 63, the first full paragraph on 63 that starts with Mazzei developed a theoretically grounded account of the U.S. stratification system in his 2008 book. And if you go on, I underlined, it said anti-black and anti-brown racism, arguing that the ongoing system of stratification in the United States can be traced back to a systemic categorical racial inequality that was endemic throughout U.S. history and that operated through a socially defined process of exclusion. Okay, so when I read that, I had to reread it again. So what they are saying is that anti-black and anti-brown racism is a direct result of stratification, which is the distribution of economic goods, and that this inequitable distribution occurs because of categorizations within race, and that this is how we get poverty, injustice, human suffering. And then he says a little further down in that paragraph, inequality is the result of a combination of practices that he documents in details. Ingrained cognitive processes that are intrinsic or biological in nature. So again, I stopped and I reread that sentence. Cognitive processes that are intrinsic. So if someone grows up believing that a certain population is lazy, doesn't work hard, the reason they're not successful is because of, these factors that they have been trained or taught to maintain, kind of, it's like prejudices, right? These prejudices and stereotypes, that will help maintain the stratification, because it's very difficult to untrain someone out of that, especially if they don't even realize they're doing it. So that is what's being talked about in that paragraph 63 that I wanted to highlight. Okay, so I know the lecture is getting a little long. I'm going to go a little faster here at the end. Oh, we only have a few pages. Okay, so stratification again is talked about on page 64. There's a big block quote. And then we end this chapter with a class conflict theory. So remember when I mentioned that you can have a pyramid, right? And at the top is the group that makes the most money, and at the bottom are the laborers. Well, this class conflict theory is all about that. So as you're reading this, you're going to be seeing terms like Marxism or Marxist. You might not know what some of those mean. There's also phrasing like split labor market theory. If you haven't taken an economics class, this is stuff you're going to be learning in an economics class. But really what you should be understanding is at the bottom of 65, the second paragraph, full paragraph. Despite their anti-racist orientation, Marxists had difficulties in explaining racial inequality and racial conflict. This was because of the primacy of class in their theory. From a Marxist standpoint, the key relationship in capitalism is that of production and the social relationship between the capitalist class and the working class, the owners and the producers. So in a Marxist theory of class and class conflict, they're not looking at race. They're just looking at the fact that there's this whole bottom mass of people that are, slaving, working away really hard to make money for this elite top class. And what is that relationship between the different groups in a production system? And why does the working group give so much power to those that make the billions off of their labor? And rather than analyzing or understanding, well, who comprises those workers? Are they all people of color? Or is it 80% people of color and 20% white individuals? A Marxist view wouldn't analyze any of that. So right away, trying to understand race through a class understanding, at least in this class conflict, doesn't work, because that's not what people are looking at when they consider that topic of class. They're not considering, well, what's the percentage at the lower class versus the middle class versus the upper class in terms of labor production and value. And one thing that I thought was really important was on page 66. If you read that full top paragraph, in the post-civil rights period, this analysis took the form of labor market segmentation studies. So there is a smaller segment in which race was analyzed in terms of this labor market segmentation studies. And segmentation means breaking apart. So scholars started realizing, well, wait a minute, separating the classes across race lines actually can depress wages overall for all of those people, though it might be less than for, say, a white community than a black community. So if you're trying to unionize and get efforts together to get equal pay or increased pay as a production worker, you're going to want to leverage unity. And if you're divided racially, it might not help. So, this paragraph in particular made me think that if in this kind of a theory, if you're working together, you're going to get higher wages. However, if you split groups off and say this group of people get this kind of a higher wage, and this group of people has this wage, and this group of people have this wage or earnings, you're never going to get the groups working together, because that one group at the top that feels like they're earning pretty good money and they're earning way better money than those groups at the very bottom aren't going to want to give up that power or that right to earn more. So there's, in essence, a racial degrouping happening in this theory, which also happened historically if you think of how, quote, some communities became white. So when Italian Americans and Irish Americans became white, they were initially relegated to the same kind of level class-wise as an African American or a slave, and they rose in that class distinction. So we can talk more about that in class. Okay, so the last 3 pages, 67, 68, 69, is a final summary of this class paradigm of race, or a class example of race. The authors re-summarize those 3 approaches that I was talking about, the market exchange, the distribution or stratification, and then finally a class conflict production. So they re-summarize. So if you were reading and you feel like you missed some points, if you read 67 through 69 pretty closely and slowly, you'll get a summary of everything that came before. And in essence, the conclusion is you cannot look at labor alone. That's talked about at the very bottom of 67. Because class-based theories of race refuse to look outside of economics. So they don't look at social, they don't look at political processes and practices, they don't look at culture, they don't look at politics. So it's too limiting. It doesn't give enough of a breadth to understand race and racial formation. And so that's their conclusion. Reach out if you have any questions. I'll try to make the next lecture a little shorter. I get really excited. Next one will be on chapter 3, Nation. Thank you.